Why are sheep included in this scheme? This scheme is intended to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. But as we saw in the last video, including sheep actually increases global greenhouse gas emissions. Also, sheep farmers are the hardest hit financially from the scheme. And finally, the inclusion of sheep harms Maori. The fundamental reasons that the government is concerned that Maori could be disproportionately affected are that 51% of emissions from Maori agribusiness come from sheep farming, 25% of sheep and beef farmed land is run by Maori farmers, and 28% of the meat processing workforce is Maori, which is why they're concerned about Maori. So it's the inclusion of sheep in the scheme that harms Maori. So why are sheep included? There is already a precedent for excluding animals where the cost of including them would outweigh the benefit. So goats are not included in this scheme because the cost of administering goats in it would outweigh the benefit from having this small amount of goats in the country recorded by it. So if the cost of having sheep in the scheme, in terms of increasing global emissions, financial harm to all farmers and financial harm to Maori farmers, outweighs the benefits, why are sheep included? Let's have a closer look at the numbers. So this is the table of the greenhouse gas emissions from the scheme as calculated by the government. Now, if we exclude sheep from the scheme, so there is no reduction in sheep numbers and no reduction in emissions from sheep, and no increase in emissions offshore from sheep, then the only effect of this scheme on the global climate is from the dairy sector and the beef sector. So the total global emissions reduce by 1.8 megatons, which is greater than the 1.1 or 1.3 initially. But that's not all the story. Because if you removed sheep from the scheme, sheep farming would be more profitable than beef or deer. So the government has been assuming that some sheep farmers would reduce their number of sheep and have more beef cattle. But this would reverse the situation. So some beef and deer farmers would reduce their numbers of beef and deer and increase their numbers of sheep instead. So let's assume that sheep production would increase to the same level that the government thought it would decrease. So instead of there being a 1.6 megaton reduction in sheep emissions from New Zealand, let's assume a 1.6 megaton increase in emissions from New Zealand. Now this would result in a reduction in emissions offshore because the extra sheep that New Zealand was producing would compete with overseas producers and they would produce fewer sheep as a result. So this would increase New Zealand's emissions but decrease global emissions. So sheep in New Zealand would emit 1.6 megatons more carbon than before, but sheep offshore would emit 2.1 megatons less than before. So in total, global emissions from sheep production would decrease by half a megaton. But that's not all. Because for farmers to increase their sheep numbers, they would have to be reducing their beef numbers. So let's assume that beef emissions decrease to the same extent that sheep emissions have increased. Because remember that methane emission is proportional to feed consumption. So if sheep are consuming enough feed to produce 1.6 megatons more emissions of methane, then beef cattle are going to be consuming the amount of feed to emit 1.6 megatons less. So we'll assume that beef reduces by 1.6 megatons, and there will be some leakage of this. And the government gave us no figures earlier on the leakage of beef emissions because they were assuming no change in production. So we'll use the figure that the government gave us for dairy because they're the same species. So let's assume that 37% of those emissions leak offshore. So global beef emissions now reduce by 1.9 megatons. And total global emissions are down 2.8 megatons. This means that excluding sheep from the scheme more than doubles the benefit to the global climate, while at the same time eliminating the economic impact on sheep farms and all but eliminating the concern about Maori being adversely affected. So why not exclude sheep? There's only one reason to not exclude sheep. excluding sheep would not bring in as much money. So, is this scheme about reducing global greenhouse gas emissions? Or is it about generating revenue?